Hello and welcome to another edition of Book Study with Brad. We're finally in Chapter 2 of Irresistible by Andy Stanley. It's been a journey so far. Those of you who have been on board with me for it you've seen kind of the struggle that it's been to make through this book. But we'll continue, and hopefully we will see. I don't know what we hope to see. I guess the hope really is that the holes in this book can strengthen your resolve and further cement the foundation of your beliefs regarding Torah, because that's what this book is. It's a direct affront to Torah observance, because it seems to be so weak so far. And it's for those of you who haven't read it yet, it's not going to get any better. But it is so weak so far that I really do hope that you come away from the experience not necessarily annoyed. I know it's annoying, but more confident in your position regarding Torah practicing. And for those of you who are watching and may not be practicing Torah just yet, I do hope that you come away from this having learned something. Maybe you'll agree with what the book says and you won't agree with what I say. I'm perfectly open to discussing that. If it's something that you'd like to discuss, feel free to send me an email. Or alternatively, maybe you come around and maybe you see the value that there is in obeying Torah after going through this book with me. But so starting in chapter 2, and before we start, I am going to take a sip. For those of you who don't know, you've probably guessed by now, I film my bots, the Old Testament study, and my book study at the same time. Actually, pretty much everything that I film, because I may be doing another video review today. Maybe. I do most of this on Sundays, and so that's why I'm oftentimes drinking the same thing and wearing the same thing, is because it was done on the same day, and oftentimes within minutes of each other. So, without further ado, Chapter 2 is titled Going Global. Ancient Israel was a means to an end. I don't need to read any more before I already have something I find wrong with this. Ancient Israel was a means to an end. Oh my gosh. I first of all, I don't know how you can skirt around the anti-Semitism of that statement. But I don't know how you skirt around the reality that Israel as a people is still alive and well today. You cannot call them a means to an end. This was actually the Holocaust actually was a huge wake-up point for the whole of Christianity, because they had subscribed to a supersessionist idea, this notion that the Jews were no longer God's people because the Christian church was God's people. And then the Holocaust happened. And it was persecution of a specific group of people, the same people we see persecuted in the Bible, and it was persecution taking place of biblical proportion. Okay? The atrocities that were committed were something you would read about in the Bible, and it caused a pause and a question for the whole of Christian scholarship, because, well, if they're no longer God's people, why is this happening to them? Why? Because as is the example that we see in the Old Testament, when God allows them to be persecuted, it is a form of chastisement. So, because God chastises the son whom he loves. So if they have been disowned, why is God chastising them like the son whom he loved? It caused a problem for Christian theology, because it had to be reconciled why Christians were not being persecuted this way, but Jews were. And that is something that I would say still to this day. Look, I get it. There are religious rights that are kind of sort of being infringed in the Western modern societies today. And there are third world countries where no form of religion is allowed. It's not just Christianity, but Islam is also not allowed, and Judaism certainly isn't allowed. But Christians tend to single out the examples of Christianity that are persecuted and act like this is the only event that's happening of this nature in the world. And so it's pretended that Christianity is the only persecuted religion in the world, and that's just not true, okay? Nobody is burning down churches and shooting up churches in America in the proportions that they are doing so to Jewish synagogues. That's not to say it's not happening. It certainly is. I could name off 3 that probably happened in the last 5 years. So there are churches that are having shootings and whatnot, and forms of persecution that are taking place there. But for the 3 that I can think of in Christian churches, I can think of probably 9 in examples of Jewish communities, Jewish synagogues, and what have you. So it will never cease to be true that the Jewish people are the single most persecuted people in the whole world. At least like as a people group. Now, if we want to talk like mathematically, I would say probably the Chinese, just because there are more of them, and so more of them are persecuted by the numbers. That's because the Jews also constitute one of the largest like minorities in the world. By largest minority, I mean there are less of them than anybody else. So anyway, continuing, I cannot believe we didn't make it beyond the first sentence of this chapter. Oh. Ancient Israel was a means to an end. That's not a slight. Yes, it is. Being a means to an end is what gives the things meaning. So the only reason that Israel ever had any meaning is because they were intended to be a means to an end. No. No, because if that's the case, then you have to ask yourself, okay, so is Jesus a means to an end? Just the whole person of Jesus. Just he's a means to an end? Because the only reason he has meaning is because he's a means to an end, right? You can't make that comparison. Good grief. Yeah. Being a means to an end is what gives things meaning, purpose. If you refuse to become a means to an end, your life will never have meaning. That's the meaning of meaning. Okay, Bill Clinton. It depends on what the definition of is, am I right? Oh. Live for yourself, and you'll only have yourself to show for yourself. Become a means to an end, and your life takes on meaning. So, you know how you become a means to an end for God? Die to yourself and your own desires, and do the things that God wants you to do. You know, the Torah. Okay, funerals teach us this. Funerals remind us that the value of a life is always measured by how much of it was given away. I know what he means. I just don't agree with that characterization. Because how much is given away is not. That's not the right way to characterize that. God created the nation of Israel as a means to a divine end. He created the nation for a global purpose. God's global plan for the nation was first announced long before there was a nation. Around 2067 BC, God promised 99-year-old Abraham a son who would become a nation that would bless the world. The entire world. Here is the original wording. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I don't think that's the original wording. Pretty sure it's in you and in your seed all nations will be blessed. But and it's I will make a great nation of you and of your seed. Let's see. God promised Abraham he would make his name great. That's Bible speak for I'll make you famous. I'm guessing this isn't the first time you've heard of Abraham. So there you go, promises kept. But here's the real news. And all peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. We can't imagine how ridiculous that sounded to a man with no people standing in the Middle East, with no people standing in the middle of nowhere. But that promise initiated a chain of events that would roll out over the course of about 2,000 years. In addition to the unimaginable scope of this promise, there was something historically peculiar about it as well. God promised to bless the world through Abraham's descendants. That didn't make any sense. Ancient people didn't bless one another. Ancient tribes conquered, plundered, and enslaved one another. Let's face it, modern nations don't bless one another. We spy, negotiate, and impose sanctions. Again, we can't begin to imagine how ridiculous this sounded to Abraham. Moving on. Abraham eventually had some people who eventually migrated to Egypt, where they eventually multiplied themselves to nation status, which made their host to nation status, which made their host nation terribly uncomfortable. Instead of kicking them out, Pharaoh put them to work as slaves. So we're summing up Genesis and Exodus like in a gross way. This is terrible. So much for all those promises. It's difficult to bless all the nations of the earth when you're making bricks for the king who considered himself master of the universe. But unlike Egypt's gods, Abraham's God was mobile. So when Abraham's God was good and ready, he showed up. He tapped Moses as his representative and sent him to Pharaoh with that unforgettable line, "Let's all say it together, let my people go." This is for those of you who have seen the Ten Commandments. That's where the line became famous. After a bit of arm twisting, Pharaoh did just that. I just can't understand the audacity of diminishing the works of God in Egypt. Yeah, we're gonna reduce the astronomical events of the Exodus story down to, well, he twisted Pharaoh's arm a little bit. It's just so the irreverence of it is just mind-blowing. Oh. The reason I feel the freedom to summarize 400 plus years of Israel's history in 4+ sentences is our familiarity with the storyline. But while many modern readers and moviegoers know the story, it's next to impossible for us to miss its significance. In the most extraordinary, drawn-out spectacle filled worthy of Hollywood's attention manner imaginable, Israel's God demonstrated his mobility and authority. Clearly his authority was not constrained by geography. The earth was his jurisdiction. His message to Pharaoh was unequivocal. You've got something that belongs to me, and I'm not leaving here without it. So, one thing that's interesting he brings out here is the mobility of Abraham's God. So, yes, in the ancient world, gods were considered to be regional. So it's not that Egypt did not acknowledge the Babylonian gods as being true deities. They believed that the Babylonian gods were restricted to Babylon, and that they couldn't extend too far beyond Babylon. So gods were understood to be regional. So if you imprisoned a Babylonian in Egypt, then his gods would be powerless to help him because his gods are in Babylon, and he is a Babylonian that is here in Egypt under the jurisdiction of Egypt's gods. And so that's how the ancient world understood the ancient pantheons. And we do see this borne out a little bit in the narrative of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar and whatnot. A lot of the statements made by Nebuchadnezzar indicate the assumption that the Hebrew God was confined to Israel. And so what we see borne out in the story is, in fact, that he's not. So there's one thing we can agree with Andy Stanley about. One by one, Israel's invisible God king humiliated Egypt's pantheon of gods. In the end, he worked it out for his people to plunder what was arguably the wealthiest nation on the planet. All this without holding anyone to the point of a sword. By the time Israel put Egypt in the rearview mirror, Egypt's economy was decimated. Clearly, Israel's one god was mightier than all of Egypt's gods combined. And all that without home field advantage. Israel's god was the visiting team. He was mobile. Mobile gods were not a thing in the BCs. Again, arguably any nation that encountered Israel understood this truth. But yes, his main point, the rest of the nations understood their gods to be immobile. Fast forward 4 months, and we find the people of Israel camping at the foot of Mount Sinai, watching Moses descend with God's instruction for the nation. We call it the Ten Commandments, but before it was over, it was more like the 600 Commandments, 613 actually. Those famous first 10 functioned a bit like a table of contents, the Cliff Notes version. Yes, I have often actually categorized it this way, as like, look, I can tell you to clean the house, or I can tell you to clean the bedrooms, and then the bathroom, and then the kitchen, and then the living room, right? So I'm now giving more detail to the single statement, clean the house. And then you could even go further still into giving details about what needs to be cleaned in each of the individual rooms. And so when people try and reduce Torah observance down to, well, Jesus only gave us these 2 commands. Okay, those 2 commands are clean the house. The 10 commandments are clean the bedrooms, bathroom, garage, kitchen, living room. And then the 613 are the details of what to clean. All right, so if you say clean the bathroom, so you're saying clean the sink, clean the bathtub, clean the toilet, clean the baseboards. And then one could even argue that the oral tradition is the specifics on how. It's the, okay, when you clean the sink, you're going to use this sponge and this cleaner, and you're going to wipe in this direction, the whole wax on, wax off. You could break it down to where the oral tradition are the specific details on how to complete these different tasks. So yeah, he's absolutely correct there. That's probably one of the first things he said that has been absolutely correct. If you grew up in church, you may remember how this most ancient of ancient constitutions began. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Translated, that was me who did that. He continued, you shall have no other gods before me. To which they thought, correct, we shall not. We saw what you're capable of. And then the statement that set Israel apart from everybody else in the neighborhood. You shall not make yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven, above, or on earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. I don't agree with the reduction of I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. That there is so much more to that, so much more that we can derive that the Jewish people understood from that statement. And I'll do another video on that another time, I'm sure. Okay, when Moses finished reading the summary of points, when Moses finished reading the summary points of all God required of the nation, they responded with a hearty, "Everything the Lord has said we will do." But of course they didn't. So this is actually, as the story goes on why God chose Israel in the first place, this is part of it, okay? So the Torah, the Genesis narrative, is ubiquitous with examples of Torah's existence prior to Mount Sinai, okay? You've probably heard me rattle off a few before, but you have examples like the fact that Noah understood clean and unclean animals before Mount Sinai. And there are any number of other examples of the fact that it existed prior to Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai was likely more of a reintroduction to a group of people who had just spent the last 400 years under pagan bondage, okay? So it's a reintroduction, not the first giving ever. The reason God chose Israel, so the reason God chose Abraham, actually, this is another example, is because Abraham would teach his children God's statutes, laws, and commandments. That's, again, it lists all three, which is another example as to, okay, well, Torah clearly existed in Abraham's time. So he would teach his children. So the notion given, actually, when Abraham is traveling through the nations, or through the land of Israel and seeing all of the nations that occupy the land, and God says, I can't displace them yet. Their transgression is not yet full. Okay, so it's clear that they're making transgressions. They are sinning. Okay, but how can you sin if you don't know what the law is? This is another evidence that Torah existed prior to Mount Sinai. There's an indication that these nations are aware of God's commandments, because you can't rightly be accused of breaking the law if you don't know that the law exists. There is a margin of there's a margin of reason even in highway traffic laws to where, like, okay, if you were pulled over for speeding in this area and within a certain amount of miles there isn't a speed limit sign, you can plead that you were ignorant. You had no idea what the speed limit was because for 20 or so miles there hasn't been a speed limit sign, right? Like, you can't be charged for breaking a law that you didn't know existed, or rather you could be charged, but you can't really be found guilty of breaking it. And so likewise with these nations, the fact that God acknowledges that they're transgressing is evidence that they were aware of these laws, at least at some point. And so as the story goes, the reason God chose Israel, the reason that Israel is different, is because of this statement. So the idea is that God introduced the Torah to all of the nations, and each and every nation examined it and thought, well, that's cool, but nah, it's not really for us. But then when it came to this point, when it came to Sinai, and Israel is introduced with the Torah, their response wasn't, nah, we don't really want to do that. Their response was, everything the Lord has said we will do. They were the only nation who agreed to it. And so this is why we see the mercy that's shown them, right, as opposed to mercy that is not shown to the other nations, because they never agreed to it even in the first place, right? But Israel said, yeah, we'll do it. And so, of course, his next statement is, but of course they didn't. Well, yeah. No, they didn't. But again, their agreement to do it actually is the reason that we see mercy shown them, even though they didn't. Let's see, and we shouldn't be surprised. They were at camp. Does anybody keep their camp commitments? I don't see a correlation between summer camp and what the children of Israel were going through. Again, we're experiencing a reduction of the biblical narrative that I hate a lot. Let's see. So he says he didn't keep his camp commitments. You probably didn't either. If you didn't grow up going to church camp, perhaps it's for the best. That I could agree with. The movies and bedtime versions of this narrative don't accurately reflect how Moses made several trips up and down Mount Sinai, each time Moses returned with even more detailed instructions for the nation. One of these mountain climbing excursions lasted 40 days. While he was gone, the natives grew restless. You may remember this part from Sunday school. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." So the mistranslation here is gross. We'll finish this part real quick because it's going to be important to explaining. So he says, seriously? God is still dictating the fine points, and his people are already abandoning the first and most important commandment. How could that be? Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol, cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." So the picture he is painting is that they are now falling into idolatry, okay? That they are quite literally worshiping other gods now. That is not how the narrative reads in Hebrew. So first of all, it doesn't say that they asked Aaron to make them gods, plural. And Aaron does not present it as their gods, plural. They ask him to make them God, right, to make them a god. And the reason is, as they say, because this Moses, we don't know what happened to him. So there's a confusion over the role of Moses. Clearly, they thought of Moses as some sort of god at this point. That's why they asked, right? So Moses was the intermediary between the people and God. And so what they were asking for was a replacement for that role, right? So they say, "Hey, Aaron, make us this." Because Moses is like, we don't know what happened to him. We don't know where Moses is, so please make us this, right? So it's not idolatry in the way that we're thinking of like Egyptian idolatry. It is accepted that probably the smaller minority might have viewed it in that way. But for the majority of Israelites who were doing this, they thought they were still worshiping the one true God. The only thing they can really be found guilty of is making a graven image, but not necessarily that they were worshiping other gods at this point, because we read in the narrative, okay, that they plan to have a holiday unto Hashem. That's how it reads. They're literally going to have a holiday for Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. So they're not worshiping another god. They're still worshiping God, but they're using improper methods of worshiping him. They're using an improper conduit, and then they tried to invent their own holiday. And so this actually should pose several questions to us regarding Christmas and Easter and the Christmas tree, right? As we may not think of it as a god, but neither did Israel think of the golden calf as a god. We can say that we're using it as a mode or a conduit of worshiping the one true God. That's exactly how Israel saw this golden calf, according to the narrative in Hebrew. And they invented their own holiday. Christmas is an invented holiday. So there's a level of crossover between the example of the golden calf and modern Christian holidays, which is funny because I think Andy Stanley would probably disagree with this point, but he's actually making it beautifully right now. So he says, "What? Those cows we just watched you make out of our plundered Egyptian gold were what delivered us from Egypt?" So there's another question, the question of why Aaron actually complied with this. So Aaron was faced with a situation where he either was going to comply with the masses or probably be killed. Because the tone that it's read, it's not really a request, it's more of a demand. He's more so facing a mob at this point. And his compliance actually reads, at least in the Hebrew text, more so as stalling, which is why, he has to separate everybody into families and take the gold one by one from each member of each family. Like this is a process that's going to take some time. So it's like he's trying to stall the process, and in hopes that Moses will finally show up. That's the way that it reads in Hebrew. Let's see. This is where most of us get confused. Why would recently freed slaves abandon the God who had recently freed them? Well, like we just discussed, they didn't. How could they adopt something they saw created before their eyes as an object of worship? Well, again, they understand how human beings are created, and they're comparing the golden calf to Moses. They say, make us this idol, you can call it that, because we don't know what happened to Moses, right? They don't say, we don't know if this God is real anymore. They say, this Moses, we don't know what's happened to him, right? So this was intended to be a replacement for Moses, not for God. See, it's confusing for us because we grew up believing in an invisible, everywhere at the same time God, but this was new territory for the people of Israel. Not having an object to worship was as confusing to them as their insistence on having one is to us. So I think this is a level where modern Christianity has... I'll finish this before I get into that. They needed something tangible, visible, stationary. That episode didn't end well. And in the end, it meant Moses had to make another trip up the mountain to fetch yet another set of tablets. So this is an area where Christianity has grossly misunderstood pagan religion and pagan practice. So, because you see, if you bow or if you kneel down in front of a cross, you're technically kneeling down in front of an idol. I know that's not a popular opinion in Christianity, but that's what you're doing. And at the back of most churches, behind the pulpit, hanging on the wall, typically is going to be a cross. So when you go to kneel down at the altar at your church, you're kneeling down in front of a cross. And, again, bring up the idea of Christmas trees. This is a form of an idol. Now, people can make the argument, well, I'm not worshiping it. Right. Neither were pagans. There's never at any point where pagans were worshiping the work of craftsmanship that they made. They did not believe that those were the gods themselves. They understood logic well enough to understand that. The understanding was that the gods are in heaven. The gods are somewhere else other than here, looking down at us and watching everything that we do. Which they can see from the heaven that they reside in, and that this statue in front of me is a representative, a conduit to that God. It's a representative of that God. So you can kneel in front of a cross and say, well, it's representative of the God that I'm worshiping, the God that I'm praying to. I'm not praying to the cross. It's representative. Okay, but then you're doing the same thing that pagan nations did. Like, it's exactly the same thing. They didn't pray to idols. They prayed to their gods using the idol as a conduit, as a representative. Which, again, we know that because that's exactly what they were asking Aaron to make, was a representative, because they didn't know what happened to their former representative, Moses. And so, yeah, there again, we see this level of crossover. It's not different in Christianity. It's just, I think Christians do not understand. They're more ignorant on pagan culture than they think. And so they think there's a difference where there really is no difference. And it's just because they don't know enough about pagan culture to know that what they're doing is identical. But continuing. So began Israel's formal relationship with the invisible, mobile God of Abraham. Freed from their Egyptian taskmasters and equipped with rules to live by, they prepared to break camp and begin their journey north to the Promised Land. But before they put Sinai in their rearview mirror, Moses commissioned the construction of a portable tent called the tabernacle to house and transport the sacred law tablets. That was not the purpose of the tabernacle, but okay. What When the construction of this tent was complete, and the stone tablets were resting safely in the wooden box constructed for that purpose, something extraordinary happened. Moses described it this way. Then the cloud of the Lord covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meetings because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. God took up residence. Nobody carried a portable statue god into the tabernacle and set it on a pedestal, as was the custom in pagan nations. When Israel's God was satisfied that everything was as it should be, he chose to inhabit the tabernacle, filled it with his glory, his presence, on his terms. But even with the presence of God in their midst, Israel was still in no position to bless all nations of the earth. Just ask Pharaoh. Nobody in Egypt was feeling blessed at that particular moment. So, Rabbi David Foreman actually has an interesting video, or a couple of videos, on this exactly. It wasn't Israel's limitations that were the reason that Egypt didn't find blessing. It was Egypt's lack of obedience that is the reason that Egypt saw no blessing. You see, he compares the Exodus narrative because of the elements that are the same across both accounts. He compares the Exodus narrative to the funeral of Jacob that we read in Genesis. And what we read, like I said, there are several elements that are paralleled, and to a rabbinic Jew, that just screams of, okay, you need to look at these two accounts better and see what there is. Why are these elements the same between both of these two stories? It's not an accident, and it's not just that the elements are the same. The way that the discussion about them is worded is identical. You can literally copy and paste certain phrases, and it fits perfectly. And so the account being that Egypt was compliant in the funeral of Jacob, and Egypt saw blessing because of it. Okay, because at the time of Joseph, Egypt was not the great kingdom that we know it to be. It was far more tribal, and so it was not one kingdom at this point. There was one central kingdom that was probably viewed as being greater than the others, but Egypt did not have ownership over all of the kingdoms, as it were. In fact, Joseph, because of the taxes that he established over the land of Egypt for the wheat to survive the famine, was able actually to conquer the lands of Egypt. They sold themselves to Egypt to be under Egyptian rulership in order to feed themselves. And this is how Egypt was blessed, is that they became the most powerful nation in the world. And it's because they were compliant and obedient to the Lord and to his people. So this is where the Exodus narrative diverts. Okay, so what would have happened? What do you think would have happened if the first time that Moses came to Pharaoh and said, look, the God of all creation has said to let his people go? And if Pharaoh, rather than getting prideful and stuck up, the same way that Pharaoh could have when Joseph came to him and said, hey, my father has asked that I and his people take him to be buried in his land, okay? So if Moses came to Pharaoh and said, hey, my father has asked to take his people to his land, and that Pharaoh had reacted the same way as the Pharaoh in Joseph's scenario, how much would Egypt have been blessed? How much would Egypt have been blessed if they had assisted Israel rather than oppressed Israel in this instance? So the blessing of the world through Israel isn't necessarily something to be done by Israel. He didn't say by your seed the world would be blessed. He said through your seed, okay? And that was the promise. And so you know what, there are several historical examples that I can give where it's like, no, the Jewish people didn't necessarily bless the world this way, but their very existence is the reason that the world could be blessed this way. One I think of is World War II, actually, because it's commonly accepted by historians that, honestly, the Nazis came very close to winning that war and had the potential to win that war. But there came a point where the Nazi commanders and Hitler had to decide whether or not they were going to use their railroad to transport supplies to the front or to transport Jews to concentration camps. And Hitler opted to transport Jews to the concentration camps. Now, understanding this meant that Hitler actually was more interested in killing Jews than he was in winning the war. He wanted to destroy the Jewish people more than he wanted to win the war, okay? And because of this, he wasn't able to supply his front lines. And because of lack of supplies, the Allied forces were able to overcome the Nazi forces, okay? So the reason that the Allied forces won World War II is because of the Jewish people. It's because somebody hated them so much that they would have preferred to kill them rather than put an effort into winning the war. So, again, through the Jewish people, the world was blessed. The world was blessed with victory over this enemy. And it is because of the Jews that is the case. So there are numerous examples where it's like, no, the intention was not that the Jewish people would bestow blessings on the whole world. It's that the world would be blessed because they exist, because they are God's people. And the example that I just gave is not the only one of that nature. There are many others where we can look in history and see that the Jewish people have suffered, and their suffering has been the reason that the rest of the world has flourished and not fallen into the same bondage. It's like Israel as a nation has at times taken the wrath that would have been poured out on the rest of the world, but rather than allow that to happen, God has chosen to inflict it on his own people. And we really should be eternally grateful for that, because that is part of this prophecy that Andy Stanley is mentioning here. So let's see. He says, one last thing. In addition to Moses' multiple trips up and down Mount Sinai, there's something else we modern Bible readers miss as well. The content, wording, and arrangement of God's instructions to Israel are in the form of a legal contract. Scholars refer to this template as a suzerainty treaty, or a bilateral suzerainty treaty. I have heard neither of those terms from any biblical scholar that I've read on the matter. Really, what it could be most likened to is a ketubah. It is a legal contract, absolutely, but it is more akin not just to a legal contract, but more than that, a marriage contract. And a marriage contract is a legal contract, but it's not just legal. It's marital, which again there's legal status to it. But it's much deeper than simply being a legal contract. So this form of agreement was used by non-equal parties when defining the terms and conditions of their relationship. In a suzerainty treaty, the greater power, the suzerain, dictates the terms to the lesser power, the vassal. Think curfew. The point being, the 10 plus commandments were more than commandments. They were just one part of a comprehensive legal contract, covenant between God and the nation. Here's the original wording. Then the Lord God said to Moses, Write down these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. The events at Mount Sinai signaled the inauguration of a covenant relationship between God and the nation of Israel. As we will discover, this covenant would define and govern God's relationship with the nation of Israel for the next 1,000+ years. The primary terms and conditions are found in Exodus 19 through 24. They are repeated, expanded, and in some cases clarified in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But the following 3 verses pretty much summarize the deal points. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This was a classic, I will as long as you do. Keep my commands and I'll keep you safe. The agreement was bilateral and conditional. If the nation of Israel didn't uphold their end of the deal, God was under no obligation to uphold his. Got it? Let's keep moving. Okay, so part of that is, and he's grossly diminishing it by not mentioning the blessings that are involved. Okay, so God didn't just give a list of commands and say, I'll keep you safe if you do all of these things. No, there are specific blessings that are listed, and it's among which are wealth, health, wealth, health, wisdom, and prominence in the world. But wealth and health being a big one. Now, not just monetary wealth, but that they would flourish as the land that they lived in would flourish. The land flowing with milk and honey, and that they would never starve or go hungry. That they would be protected from certain sicknesses. None of these diseases which I inflicted on Egypt will be afflicted on you. So, yeah, there's a lot of diminishment because we're spending a great detail explaining, the plethora and the myriad of commands, and then we're just going to reduce God's end of the bargain down to, well, I'll protect you. No, it's much more than that. The blessing that comes from obeying Torah is almost tenfold what the effort is to obey it. Which, there's something to be said for that as well. Okay, but he says, fast forward. Israel eventually arrived safely in the Promised Land. Once they arrived, however, they didn't do much in the way of blessing the inhabiting nations. Instead, they conquered, and on the occasion plundered their way to dominance in the region. So, again, we're making a comparison that was never intended to make. God had already foreordained that those people would be displaced. He had prophesied that their transgression of God's commandments would be brought to such a level that they would have revoked their own right to exist. Okay, that's the point. Israel was never intended to bless those nations. It was always intended that those nations would be displaced. So, you're making a comparison that was never intended to be made. After several generations operating as a loosely organized theocracy ruled by judges, the elders of the nation decided it was time for something new. It was time for Israel to grow up and start acting like all the other nations. That would require a king, a visible king. It was never God's intention for Israel to have a king other than himself. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet. This is prophetic about kings coming from the line of Judah. That's the whole point of that. You also, if Israel was never intended to have kings, then how do you have King Messiah? Like that, you cannot divorce the intention of kingship over Israel from the messianic prophecy. It doesn't work. The whole point to Messiah was that he would be a king. But all the cool kids had kings. So yeah, it was never God's intention for Israel to have a king other than himself, but all the cool kids had kings. So the elders and leaders of the nation confronted the prophet Samuel and insisted he appoint a king. Samuel checked with God and received this response in return. Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. Ouch. So, that ouch, by the way, is something that he wrote. That's not me responding to the book. I haven't looked into what translation he uses for this book, because I'm pretty sure that's not exactly how that reads. The general idea is there, but I don't think he says they have rejected me as their king. I'm pretty sure it just stops at they've rejected me. Let's see. As they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day. So they were asking for a king from the time they left Egypt? Well, that doesn't sound right. So we're clearly talking about something else, not just the desire for a king. Forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know that the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. Okay, so I think he stops early there. Samuel returned to the elders and did as God instructed. He did his best to scare the king out of them, but to no avail. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. What they said next set the stage for what happened next. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us, to go out before us, and to fight our battles. Right. So that's a valid point. That one I'll give him. Because the point of Israel was to be distinct from the other nations and not like them. So yeah, for sure. But understand exactly what they're asking for. They're asking for a leader who will lead from the front, which is something that humanity does need. It's something that does need to be tangible. And they always had a leader who led from the front. It would seem up until this point. So, Samuel at this point being the high priest, the leader of the people, this prophet, was not the same as Moses. He was somewhat diminished. See, Moses led from the front. Joshua led from the front. And if you go through the whole book of Judges, what you find is leaders who led from the front. Okay, this is what a king does, and historically this is always what kings did, except for weak kings. There are some weak kings in history. There are a lot of weak kings in history that did not lead from the front, but it was expected in the ancient world that a good king would lead from the front. Okay, and so what it seems like is Israel probably came to a point where the leader that they looked up to was not one who led from the front. It was not one who was going to fight the battles and be at the front line, one of the first to experience that initial clash with their enemies. And that is what any man needs. There are countless stories from any war that America has fought in, where you will hear the differences between the leaders who led from the front and the leaders who led from the back. Okay, one I can think of is D-Day. I can't remember the specific officer's name, but you could tell his men were scared. They're on the airplane. They're paratroopers, and definitely scared of what was about to happen. And so their officer stood up, and I guess he said a few words. Obviously, a good one would always say, "Look, men, there's some good men who will die." But then the particular part of the story that always stood out to me, that I've always carried with me, is that this officer, when he got done speaking his words, the door to the plane opened. It was time for them now to jump off. And he said, "All right, let's go, men." And he jumped off first. And the survivors from this plane all attested that, look, that was the moment where there was not an ounce of fear on the plane anymore. They were all ready and anxious to follow him out the door of the plane. Because that's what men need. Men at war need a leader who will lead from the front. We need someone who is willing to look hell itself in the face and say, I am not afraid of you. And then to look back at the men that he's leading and say, come on, follow me. Let's go. That is what men need, because men don't experience fear when you have that kind of leader. There's no room for it, because this leader that you look up to, he's already exhibited that he is going to do what it takes, and that's a man worth following. So, sure, I'll grant that Israel at this point is trying too hard to be like the other nations, but what are they really after? Let's look and see what they're really after, because it would seem that this point is unique in Israel's history, because prior to this, they always had a leader who led from the front. But it would seem this is a point in history where they didn't have that. So one has to ask if they had a leader, because Israel always had a leader. Whether or not he held the official title of king, they always had a leader who basically functioned as a king. So really it's an argument of semantics at this point. What it seems they were looking for was somebody who would lead from the front. And so they went about solving that problem in the wrong way, which is oftentimes the case. Human history is replete with examples where there's been a problem and we have tried to solve it the wrong way, and then years later we reap the consequences of that. I would say even the feminist movement, when it started, first wave feminism, definitely had noble intentions, and there was a legitimate problem that needed to be addressed. I think that feminism was the incorrect answer to that problem, and so now, generations later, we are now reaping the consequences of that incorrect way of handling that problem. I rarely get political. You can disagree with me on that if you'd like. I'd be more than willing to have a discussion about the problems that have spun off from that movement and how it has affected God's people. Understand what I'm saying is how this has affected God's people, not just the world, not just America, although there's arguments I could make for that, but I'm specifically speaking with reference to God's people and the church. It's definitely had its effect. And I'd be more than willing to have a discussion about that. But let's see. Okay. The problem, of course, was God did not intend for Israel to be like all the other nations. God intended for Israel to stand out from all the other nations, because he was planning to do something through Israel on behalf of all the other nations. They were a means to a global end. Again, no. What God was planning to do through Israel was not on behalf of all the other nations. I would say it was definitely for all the other nations in the aspect that it made a pathway for all the other nations into Israel. Understand what's happened here. We just went through the Sinai covenant, right? So God already selected Israel as his people. He's already chosen them. They've already become sanctified at this point. They have become set apart. They are a holy people already. Okay? They've already had their exodus. So the point to this means to an end that he's referring to was to give the rest of the nations of the earth the opportunity to visit Sinai themselves and join this people that has already been sanctified. And we'll talk about that in the New Covenant probably in another video. In the end, they caved to peer pressure and got what they asked for, a king. Several, actually. For decades, they had more than one at a time. As predicted, most of Israel's kings were disasters. The nation paid for this decision in treasure and blood. In this way, they did become like all other nations. In spite of this, God kept his promise to Abraham. He did not abandon his global purpose for the nation. All the nations of the earth would indeed be blessed through Israel, through a nation that insisted on being like all other nations. And that's the end of the chapter. Real quick there, again, we're diminishing the kingship of David, and then further diminishing the kingship of Solomon, where, in fact, the whole world was blessed through Israel because of the kingship of Solomon. This has been a painful book so far. We made it through a whole chapter. We went a little bit longer. I think we're right at an hour at this point, so thank you for sticking with me through it and listening to me. Now, we got off subject a little bit a couple of times, but I'm known to rant, and again, these are done candidly, specifically for that purpose. It's, you're getting to know me a little bit more. That's why this is exclusive content. So yeah, this has been fun. Join me again next time for Chapter 3, Temple Tantrum. Okay, this is where he's going to basically do nothing but talk smack about the temple for a whole chapter, and how the temple was never God's original intention, and we'll discuss all the problems with that. But as always, again, I hope this has blessed you, and I definitely hope that you will continue to join me through this series, and I hope that we all grow a little more from it. Shalom.